we're broadening our horizons, and we've covered the Turkish side, but we've not really addressed to any great extent in the past few years what I would call the Levant proper, the Arab Levant. And so this evening's talk is almost the start of that, looking at one particular aspect of how America began its influence in the Middle East. And it's not, what you would expect. If you approach the Middle East from the lens of the British or the French, it's more about power politics, and yet, perhaps today you would think that this would be true of America, but no, it was quite different. And I'm delighted that we have Professor Brian VanDeMark to talk to us about that. A little introduction for Brian, in that he is Professor of History at the US Naval Academy in Annapolis, and he's there since 1990. He attended college at the University of Texas in Austin and graduate school at UCLA. He's authored several books on US history, including American Sheikhs, Two Families, Four Generations, and the Story of America's Influence in the Middle East, which is going to be the topic this evening, and co-authored Robert McNamara's #1 best-selling Vietnam memoir, In Retrospect. His most recent book is Road to Disaster, A New History of America's Descent into Vietnam. Before I hand over to Brian, Brian's made clear that he would very much like this to be a discussion. He will lead the discussion, but if you have comments, questions, please do make yourselves known during the talk. How to do that? If you are familiar with the Zoom controls, you can raise your hand. You can use the chat function. You can turn on your video and wave. You can even speak up. And I will try to catch you and bring you into the conversation. If you've got a question, if you've got a comment, something you want to share, please do so. So I'm now going to hand over to Brian, but I'm just going to set up his presentations. Okay, so I hope to see that. Brian, are you all set?
All set, Quentin, thank you.
Great. Okay, so let's proceed, okay?
Okay. First of all, Quentin, I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation today. It's an opportunity for me to share what I've learned, and an opportunity for me to learn what other people think and the questions that they have related to the topic itself. I just want to begin briefly with the personal history of my interest in this topic. People have asked me quite often, what drew you to AUB? Do you have a personal connection? What was it? And the answer is actually a fairly simple one, which is I've been broadly familiar with the history of American involvement in the Middle East for a long time. And that deeper, longer history resonated powerfully with me in the early 2000s, particularly in the era of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, because that period of American involvement in the Middle East, which has lasted now for the better part of 20 years, is largely the story of guns and destruction. And I wanted Middle Easterners, as well as Americans and people throughout the world, know and to understand that America's involvement in the Middle East has not always been just that. And that if you take the story back to the very beginning, it's a very different quality of involvement, as you pointed out, Quentin. It's not the traditional power politics approach. It had to do with education. And along the way, Daniel Bliss and others who founded the American University of Beirut learned through experience, developed wisdom, and eventually created what is today the premier universities in all of the Middle East. And it's a wonderful story. It's sometimes a difficult story, but it's an important one, I believe, for people in the region to understand. And that's why I was drawn to it, and that's why I wrote about it. So what I'm going to do is very briefly go through 3 themes that I developed in the book. And they relate to the evolution of the school time, the leadership of the school for much of its history, and then a brief discussion about the future agenda for AUB. Now, of course, that final theme is much more subjective and open to discussion and debate. But if we could, Quentin, let's turn to the first slide. The evolution of AUB, which began as the Syrian Protestant College, is a fascinating one to me because it's a very human story. And in many ways, it's a metaphor for the whole arc of American history in terms of its involvement in the Middle East. And where I want to begin is with a very young, ambitious, naive, and arrogant missionary named Daniel Bliss, who arrived in Lebanon in the 1850s, full of ambition to convert non-Christians to Christianity. And it didn't take Daniel Bliss very long to realize that he wasn't going to get very far pursuing that agenda. And he had the flexibility, intuition, the maturity to alter his goals and objectives. And what he did was he took what was a very humble missionary school and converted it into an institution of learning where you're not preaching to students, you're teaching them. And I think that was a profound shift in his mindset and his approach to his life's work. And the benefits of that were immeasurable, not only for him and the school, but for the people who passed through the school. What they did was he and those who helped found the school began to teach those who attended it how to overcome cultural barriers. And that's crucially important because in that region of the world, as you pointed out, there's an immense cultural diversity tied to matters of religion, ethnicity, and so forth that have created a lot of barriers over the time. And the intent of the school to overcome a lot of those challenges, I think, is particularly admirable. They listened, that early generation encouraged enlightenment and independent thinking. And that, I think, is the independent thinking is a typically American quality, which I believe offered opportunities for students in the Middle East to reconceptualize what an education was and what an education can do for you in your life after you leave school. Just as importantly, it became a neutral ground where students lived the ethos of tolerance and mutual respect for each other and very different backgrounds. And that, to me, too, is a very significant contribution that Bliss, American missionaries who created the school, made to the region. It went against the grain, and it encouraged Arab Christians, Arab Muslims, Jews to study together, to work together, and to solve problems together. And not in an abstract theoretical way, but in a very real, human, day-to-day. And to me, that is the greatest contribution of the school then and now. What I want to do, too, is personalize this whole story, if I may, by looking at the leadership of the school over many, many generations. And before I talk about specific individuals, I want to make some broader thematic points. So if we could turn to slide 2, Quentin, please. What all of the leaders of the school over time shared in common was boldness, persistence, vision, and resilience in the face of adversity. And that is a very unusual, rare, and extraordinarily powerful combination of qualities when it comes to leadership, which were necessary given the tempestuous nature of the region and the politics of the region throughout history. Bliss and those who followed him, particularly Bliss and the early generation of American missionaries, they shed their American arrogance and Western paternalism, and instead they cultivated tolerance, patience, generosity, and understanding for those of other faiths and religions. And for someone of Daniel Bliss's generation, an American Protestant missionary of the mid-19th century, to travel that road and make that journey was not easy, but it was extraordinary, and it was exceptionally constructive in terms of its consequences. He and those who have led the school over time have all learned through hard experience that the key, the crux of the matter, is to engage Middle Easterners on their own terms, to respect them, to work with them, to open their minds so that they can create a better life and a better quality of life for themselves and their communities. And AUB has done a splendid job of that over time. They all, in their own ways, at different times, confronted the realities and limits and frustrations of American involvement in the Middle East. And particularly in the era of the Lebanese Civil War and much of the period since then, those limits and frustrations and challenges have been very real and very painful. But their leadership was such that it didn't deter them. And I think there's a powerful lesson in that, in the sense that when the going gets rough, you persist. You don't give up. You don't throw up your hands and say, oh, it's too tough, it's impossible, it's hopeless. There's no point in going on. You persist and you are resilient in the face of adversity. And the great leaders of AUB have all understood that. I think the other thing that they shared in common, which to me is extraordinarily admirable, is that I'm going to use an expression that midshipmen at the Naval Academy use quite often, which is they walked, meaning that they didn't just tell students at the university that you should embrace goals in life beyond me, myself, and I, but you actually act and live them out. And they did that through their service. They walked that talk, both in terms of their contributions to the university and also to the larger Middle East. And that old saying is true: actions speak louder than words. And you can tell people you mean well. You can tell people that it's not power and prestige. You can tell people that mutual respect and toleration is an admirable goal, but acting it out and living it is what is most powerful, and they have done that. And what I want to do is go over just a few examples of individuals who demonstrated leadership by example at the Syrian Protestant College, which later became AUB. So if you would, Quentin, let's go to slide 3. I've already mentioned Daniel Bliss. I've talked about his initial arrogance today, but I want to stress again the fact that he channeled his determination and optimism in a practical direction. He didn't allow his frustration and disappointment to overwhelm him or embitter him. And as a result of that, by surmounting his preconceptions, he learned how to touch and improve lives of people through education rather than through proselytization. And I think that meant a very great deal to him, because in his heart of hearts, he wanted to help people. The way he defined helping people initially was very different than the way he realized was the most constructive way of helping people. His son, Howard Bliss, was groomed by his father, Daniel, to take over the leadership of the school. Initially, he resisted it. He felt that it wasn't his calling, that he didn't have the talents of his father, but he eventually embraced that and served as president of the school during a very tempestuous period of Middle Eastern history. That is the years before, during, and immediately after what Europeans call the Great War in America, which was World War I. And what Howard did was he kept the school going at a time when that itself was an exceptional accomplishment. And along with that, in the period during and after the war, and this is something I particularly admire, is that he put local popular interests above national and imperial interests, which very few Westerners did in that history of the Middle East. I could go into details, but they're in the book. The fascinating question to me is, why did he do so? It's because he grew up and identified with Middle Easterners. And that's another dimension of this story, which is very compelling to me, which is traditionally throughout the history of American involvement in the Middle East, missionaries and the descendants of missionaries are those Americans who understand the Middle East and its people most intimately. They know the language, they know the culture because they live it. And it gives them an empathy and a compassion, and which to me is very, very impressive. Bayard Dodge, who served after Howard Bliss, also during a difficult period of the school's history, that is the Second World War, he confronted a lot of challenges, and along the way, he championed very progressive values. For example, he was a strong advocate of the education of women at the university level in the Middle East.
Not sure what that is. Not sure what that is.
Technical problems happen. He advocated tolerance and independence for the nations and peoples of the region. He deeply respected the Middle East's various religious traditions, but I think the challenge for Bayard Dodge was coming to terms with the emotional appeal and impact of Zionism. That was a difficult transition for the school, it was a difficult transition for the region, and it was a difficult transition for him. His son, David, kept the school going through much of the trauma of the early era of the Lebanese Civil War. Like Howard Bliss, he was introverted, quiet, unassuming, and didn't display what would, at an apparent to be natural leadership qualities. But what he had was quiet courage and endurance, which I think surprised himself, but reassured and inspired other people. And like many of the other leaders throughout the history of the school, he lived the ethos of service to the university and to the larger Middle East. He made personal sacrifices uncomplainingly. And that example, I think, is a very illuminating and enlightening one. Malcolm Kerr, who succeeded David Dodge, he had made his academic career in the United States, but he had grown up in Lebanon. His parents had committed their lives and careers to the school, and he grew up as a part of that. And I believe that his principles and a sense of duty conquered his fears. He understood the dangers that were involved in returning to lead the school in the early 80s at the very intense moment of political friction and hatred in the region. And he ultimately gave his life for the school and the idols because he loved them. And there is no more powerful demonstration of commitment than, as I said before, walking the talk. And Malcolm Kerr walked the talk. John Waterbury and Peter Dorman, who have followed Malcolm Kerr in the years since, among other presidents, have worked to keep the university alive and afloat in the face of many challenges, too numerous to go through it here and now. But the important thing to me that they grasped, and that I want our audience to grasp, is they understood the bedrock wisdom that all of their predecessors have understood, which is the only way to overcome fear and hatred in a deeply tribal culture of the Middle East is understanding, because understanding each other is the opening the door to working together and solving problems together and learning to live together. If we can, Quentin, let's turn to the final slide. I'm just going to offer a few general remarks and observations about the school's future, keeping in mind that these are very subjective opinions. I think it's very important for the school to demonstrate needs, and not just words, as it has continued to do, that it offers rather than imposes the best of American and Western values. It's living the creed of service through education. And in my opinion, that is much more admirable and frankly far more powerful than guns. It needs to, and I believe it will, hold fast to the ideals of intercultural engagement, mutual respect, and tolerance, because that's what the school has been about since its very early days, and that's what the region so desperately needs and tends to when it exists. I think what's important for the school to do is to do what it's done before, which is to teach Middle Easterners of all faiths and perspectives that they can live together, they can work together, and they can solve problems together. They, in the process of that, have to make clear that the university, the staff, the students who are there understand the politics of the region in terms of why these very divisive opinions exist, and that they all exist for their own reasons, and it's imperative that each group grasp that fundamental point and learn to work around it and to live through it. In the case of Muslims in the region, I do believe that modernity has posed a powerful challenge to the traditionalism of Islamic culture. And to the degree that the university is able to demonstrate an empathy and understanding for that, it's accomplishing its mission. A more controversial position, but it's one that I hold very strongly, is I do believe that the university needs to return to its roots and embrace the admission of Jewish students as it once did in earlier decades. It's very controversial. It may be pie in the sky, but bold leadership is the only way to break down barriers and to solve problems that clearly are not getting solved in other ways. By getting Israelis to attend AUB, as earlier Jews did, that's a way for Arabs and Jews to do what they did in previous generations, which is to come to realize that they share a humanity, that they have different backgrounds, but they're all human beings, and they can learn how to work together and live together and solve problems together. So I think I'm just going to stop there, and I'm extremely interested in hearing people's questions and comments about what I've presented and other matters that I perhaps failed to address.
Does anyone would anyone like to lead off? And I've got an immediate sort of small question, Brian, if I may. Daniel Bliss, when he set out, did he speak Arabic? Did he, what training, and how prepared was he for what he found?
Completely unprepared.
Right.
I think he was riding the crest of American arrogance and naivete. But, and this is the important but, he very quickly realized what he know and what he needed to learn, and that his goal remained the same, which is to connect with people, but how he achieved the goal shifted over time. He and his wife and all of their children became utterly fluent in Arabic, which is not an easy language for a native English speaker to speak, but he had the humility to realize if you really want to touch people's lives and connect with them on a human level, you have to show them the respect of mastering their own language. And for me, Bliss is first among equals in terms of exceptional leadership. I mean, he had a lot of drive, a lot of ambition. He aimed, he was hunting big game, and he created a great school. But the way he did it and the means by which he accomplished that were utterly different than those he assumed he would be applying when he was on that ship on the way to the Middle East and when he got off the ship there in Beirut. But life has a tendency, does it not, to teach us those lessons. Our expectations are often not in consonance with reality, but maturity lies in recognizing that, adjusting to that, and still pursuing your goals, just through different means.
Brian, I know we've got some pictures. How do you want to take us through the gallery of pictures
I'd be happy to. Craig is very kindly put together for us a collection of
Shall we
photos.
do that? Because that may also stimulate some other thoughts and questions.
Yes, indeed.
So anyway, the cover here, this is the book we're referring to, and there we have a picture. I think that's Daniel Bliss, isn't it?
Yes.
And on the right
is Beirut Dodge.
Beirut Dodge. Okay. Oh, and there's his ID card.
Yes, this is Daniel later in life, and you can just see the boldness, the determination is written all over his face. And I would love to be able to get into a time machine and go back and meet him and just interact with him and sort of feel his personality. And because it took someone of exceptional drive and ambition and vision to create what he did. This is a view of Beirut. It shows what all of those who have been there know, which is it's an extraordinarily beautiful city in an extraordinarily beautiful part of the Middle East. You're seeing West Beirut, portions of the AUB campus, and in the distance, the Lebanon range. I had the privilege of visiting Beirut and researching at the AUB when I was writing this book. I believe it was in 2008 or 2009. And I immediately fell in love with the city and the beauty of Lebanon. I don't think anyone can fail not to fall in love with it when they visit it. It is so extraordinarily beautiful. Here is a view of the campus in its earlier years. It does illustrate an interesting fact, which is that Daniel Bliss was a savvy operator. And not only did he want to create the finest university in the region, he wanted to build it on the finest real estate in the region. And he worked with the Ottoman authorities to gain the concession for this piece of land, which is on a promontory into the Mediterranean, which is, again, breathtakingly beautiful in terms of the vistas that it affords. The landscape of the campus is extraordinary. Here's some very early buildings at the university. He was a builder. You can see, let's see in the distance, the building on the right with the tower was one of the earliest structures. There you go, at the university. And in the period of the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was a progressive construction, which has continued over many, many decades. And today, it is a sprawling campus with a variety of architecture, very beautifully thought through, landscaped. It's an extraordinary environment for the students to live with each other and learn with each other. And I think the leadership of the school has always understood the power of an aesthetic to accompany an institution of learning. It, to me, is one of the most beautiful campuses in the world. Here is a view of the university from the Mediterranean. And I would think this was probably early 20th century, dating based on the buildings that I can see here. And it gives you a very vivid indication of how extraordinarily dramatic the landscape of the university is and what a very, very beautiful piece of land Daniel Bliss was able to secure from the Ottomans. This, of course, is the first of several photos that will follow that show the most important part of the story, which is the people who passed through AUB over the years. This college hall, I believe their first version of that one, and it shows you tennis courts in the immediate foreground as an indication of how rounded the educational experience at AUB was for its students. Bliss realized that that was part of the educational goals that he wanted to achieve. Here are other students standing along the walkways at the school in the early decades of the 20th century. And this, I don't know the name of it. I think Ann Kerr, who is with us, could probably immediately identify it for us. But it does show you the elegant architecture that is characteristic of so much of the infrastructure at the university. It impressed me as a visitor, it impresses students. And it's a material symbol of the richness of the educational experience at AUB. There you can see Dodge Hall, named after the Dodge family, which helped Daniel Bliss financially to achieve his goal and to realize his dream. These are more buildings, all different in their own way, all very beautiful and all part of a greater whole.
Brian, could you say a bit more about how was the Syrian Protestant College and then the university financed? So you mentioned the Dodge family.
Yes.
Where did the money, was it just through from the Dodges, or did it come from subscription?
All of the above. It was, Daniel Bliss was initially bankrolled by William Dodge, who was a very wealthy man, but he was also a very religious Puritan. And for all Americans who know the history of Puritanism in American culture, which is fundamental to it, William Dodge, despite his material wealth, understood that that wasn't the ultimate point of life. How you use your wealth that matters. And he wanted to help Daniel Bliss create a great school. And he therefore put up a tremendous amount of money to get the school going. His son Stuart worked with Daniel Bliss in the years to come to also run the school and to help finance it. But along the way, Daniel Bliss, as I mentioned in the book, he was a very good salesman among many other qualities and attributes. And he had the counterintuitively attractive gumption to approach very wealthy Brits and ask them to support an American university in the Middle East. And of course, many of them did, because for them, as for William Dodge, it wasn't about the size of your bank account or the nationality of people running the school, but what the school is intended to accomplish that really mattered. And over the years, there's been funding from many, many different sources, both in the region and outside of the Middle East, because people in different places of different faiths and different traditions understand the vital role that it plays in that part of the world. It's a particularly vital role in that part of the world, given its diversity and the contentiousness that has grown out of that diversity.
What was the transition between the Syrian Protestant College and the American University of Beirut? What caused that? How long did the Syrian Protestant College last for before it became something else?
In the early 20th century, particularly as the school continued to grow in size and stature, and it became more secularized, I think it became an expression of the reality, which is that Daniel Bliss began as a missionary and he became an educator. And the school's name and title reflected that transition over time.
Okay. We've still got a few more slides.
Because it shows student life at the university. And as you notice here in this photo, and that's what's particularly important about this photograph, they are women. And as I mentioned earlier, Mayor Dodge, one of his highest priorities was to open the doors of AUB to Middle Eastern women. And in the context of 100 years ago,
do you know roughly what year that started?
In the early 20s, which again is extraordinary given the social conservatism of Islamic culture. But he thought broadly, and he understood the potential and the constructive benefits of cultivating the talents and abilities of more than just half the population. Here is an illustration of the medical contribution that the university has made over time. And its hospital, the AUB hospital, is without question the finest hospital in Beirut and one of the very best in the entire region, and was even then. These look like chemistry students in probably the 30s or 40s. It illustrates that an education at AUB was a liberal arts education, but it was also a very practical one, learning practical skills and practical scientific techniques. Because Daniel Bliss was a visionary, but he was also a very practical man. Here, microscopes, sort of reiteration of that point I just made. And this, I love this photograph because when you scan the audience, you see so many different faces, so many different styles of clothing, which illustrate how many differences exist in the Middle East. And traditionally, they've often lived in atomized, isolated bubbles, separate from one another. But the grace of AUB was it brought them all together and allowed each to see the other as a human being and not an abstract alien threat.
Now, there are quite a few children in the
Yes.
picture on the bottom row. I mean, would they be?
They would be the children of faculty, is my hunch.
Okay. Right.
Here
The
again
last one
is a more recent photograph. This is probably dates, I would say, from the 50s or 60s. And might be familiar with this particular image. But again, it drives home how important the education of women was at the school. And in the context of that time and that place, doing this, opening the doors to women in the early to mid-decade of the 20th century was a real step forward in persuading families and communities that this was an enlightened step to take, I think, was also an important accomplishment.
Now, does anyone want to ask a question or comment? Bernard, if you unmute yourself, and then David.
Can you tell us a little bit about the governing body of the AUB and perhaps the AUC as well? Have they changed? Are they located in America? Are they treated in the region? And do they share the same aspirations as?
My understanding, Bernard, is that the controlling entity at AUB has been and still is the Board of Trustees. But the composition of the leadership of the school over time has become much more diverse and much more local. I think that's an important distinction for all of us to understand. And the faculty has become much more diverse too. There's an AUB office effectively in New York City. One of its representatives, Ada Porter, I believe, is attending our discussion today, and she would probably be in an excellent position to answer your question far more intelligently than I can. Ada, are you there, I hope?
I've not seen her. But,
if you'd like, I can contribute something here. Shall I hop in here?
Please
Okay.
do.
Thank you. That's an important question. And Brian answered it very well. And let me just add a little bit. For the first time, both universities, now AUB, I taught at AUC for many years. And of course, I was at AUB for many years too. AUB and AUC both have presidents of Arab origin, but who have been educated in the US and lived in the US a long time. So they're the perfect bridging right now. And in the political situation that exists, it's very important to have this bridge between the cultures. I would like to add that our current president at AUB fits the description perfectly that Brian gave of Daniel Bliss, visionary, tremendously active and energetic, and sees the future of AUB as having to fit into the current political situation of Lebanon.
Right. And I'm going to bring Bernard in now, who's been like to ask something.
Yes, why originally America felt the need to get involved to educate the Lebanon youth when the French cultural supremacy was established in Lebanon?
Bernard, that's a very fascinating and interesting question. And I think it involves a couple of dynamics. One is American ambition. Remember, the United States in the mid-19th century is feeling its oats and wanting to project its culture more than its power throughout the world. And the other, of course, is the more parochial competition between a Protestant missionary evangelist and the Catholic Church. Daniel Bliss wanted to demonstrate to himself, to the region, and frankly to the larger world, that Protestants could build an educational infrastructure in Beirut, Lebanon, which was the peer of the finest French schools in Syria.
Thank you. Good answer.
If I can, I'll come back. David wants to come back in, but if I can pick up on one of Bernard's points. So the French were there as well with, I think, Collège Saint-Joseph. And then what did the Brits do as the other sort of colonial power competing against the French? Did they have any educational mission?
Yes, in fact, there's a lovely little anecdote toward the very beginning of the book where Daniel Bliss stops in Malta way to his destination in Beirut and gazes in awe at the Malta Protestant College, which was the cutting edge of Protestant education in the Mediterranean in the 1850s. And I think what Daniel Bliss took from that was, it can be done, and I'm going to outdo the Brits. But again, just to add a bit of important historical generosity, shall we say, Bliss solicited and successfully achieved funding from the Brits once the MPC, or Malta Protestant College, folded, because they understood that his goal was fundamentally the earlier Malta Protestant College's goal too. And they had the grace and the wisdom to put the objective, rather than the flag flying over the objective, first.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else like to ask something or comment? Just unmute. Okay.
Can I ask something?
Please do.
30 or 40 years ago, David and I lived in Cairo, and we were well aware of the activities, very activities of AUC, and you knew some of the very distinguished American professors there. AUC at that time was not young in those days, particularly men, but certainly young students who wanted to study law or medicine as a career in Egypt didn't go to AUC because it didn't offer medicine or law as graduate programs. It was an undergraduate school. And it was becoming, we were told, and this isn't good, it will have changed, rather almost a finishing school. Wealthy young women went there to perfect their English and to do artistic stuff, the humanities. What is the situation of AUB? Does it offer law or medicine or anything like that? What is the student body at AUB? I have two questions. How does does the current regime allow it to operate as it would like? And what is the character of the student body? What do students go on to further degrees afterwards? Or, tell me about the student body, given what I saw at AUC.
I'm happy to tackle that question initially, but I also want to then turn it over to Ann Kerr, because she's far more knowledgeable about the contemporary current dynamic than I am. The student composition at AUB has evolved over time. I think initially the student body tended to be the children of the wealthy and the well-connected in the region. But over time, even though that has remained an element of the school's population, the university and the leadership of the school has made a consistent effort to bring in scholarship students from non-privileged backgrounds, because they understand that that's part of the whole fabric of Middle Eastern society, and they have the wisdom to understand that educating simply the upper classes is not really accomplishing the goal they want to accomplish, which is to create possibilities for all of Middle Eastern society and not just the privileged.
Sorry.
And can you?
Our courses delivered in English?
If this lady would speak into the microphone, because we can't really hear her.
I made my question, but I would just like to add.
It's not clear.
Our courses delivered in English.
Yes. Shall I, Brian, would you like to go ahead? Shall I go ahead?
No, please, I defer to you, Anne. Please do.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, just let me compliment you, Brian, on what you've contributed to the Middle East and to these two American universities. And I couldn't agree with you more about as far as the tremendous influence they've had for positive elements of our culture and Western culture. But AUB and AUC have ridden the political tides that have gone on for years and years and years. And since we were there 30 or 40 years ago, of course, tremendous changes have happened. One thing at AUC, they had to adapt to the devaluation of the pound, and they had to. I can't go into finances too well, but it would cause tremendous problems with tuition and very basic things, which they have survived, and they now have a fine president, Ahmed Dalal, who is American trained, an Arab historian, and it's very nice for AUC to have that kind of intellectual leadership now in the university. AUB, which of course I know much better because I went there as a student in the 1950s and have been going back ever since. The student body has changed. I think we were early women students when in the 50s, when it became pretty common to have women. Before that, it wasn't, there were just a handful here and there. But over the years, AUB has really adapted to the political culture as it has had to, been forced to. But during the Civil War, when my husband and I were there, for example, all the student clubs had a political identity. You know, the environmental club was the certain political party. The theater club was the Maronites, etc. So it's always, you couldn't keep the politics out of AUB. It's always been there. Today, the situation at AUB is different than it's ever been before. And this is because of the condition of Lebanon being really unsustainable at the moment. And what the future lies, we don't know. The student body is mixed, very, very well mixed, as Brian said, very diverse, religious-wise and culturally, socially. We have many, many student scholarships. A huge percentage of the students are on some sort of scholarship. AUB has been an English-speaking university since the late 1800s, English teaching. During the war, Civil War, that declined a bit, the quality of English, but it has come back since very well. I'd like to just endorse the current president, who is doing a tremendous job trying to ride this tide of complete instability of the country. How can AUB survive? A third of the faculty have left out of necessity. They just couldn't afford to stay there any longer if they had children in college, etc. So now, and this is not a secret, but it's not widely publicized, we're looking at all sorts of possibilities of how to sustain the university in these really, really dreadful times, economically, financially, politically, etc., in Lebanon. So there's a possibility we're looking of starting a twin campus, and definitely not to say we're replacing AUB, because AUB will always be the mother campus. But for years, other areas in the Middle East have asked us to go and build campuses in their countries, and we've always resisted, thinking that AUB should have all of our resources. But at this point, we just have to consider a twin campus, and Cyprus is being seriously considered as a possibility. There's a lovely old Dibs factory, molasses factory, in Paphos, the southern part of Cyprus, if you call it southern. And that's being seriously considered as a twin campus. There are requests from Gulf countries to build a campus there. Again, our mission would be just what Brian described as the early mission of Daniel Bliss. That is to take these qualities of tolerance, of individual representation and tolerance of each other to these countries. And it would be, in a sense, another version of the mission of the early founders of AUB. We don't know what will happen, but we'll be progressing pretty fast, I think, in the coming year.
Thank you. I've got a question, if I may, Anne and Brian, is what is AUB's sense of identity? I mean, as Levantines, having family that comes from all sorts of different parts of the world and mixed up in the Levant, we sometimes have mixed identities. Is AUB American in some sense? Is it Lebanese? Is it neither? Is it just AUB?
I would say there's even an AUB accent. I think we all spoke a certain kind of English in AUB. I mean, we Americans, yeah. And I don't know if I would say that about Arab AUB alumni, but there is an AUB, maybe, I won't say snobbery, but pride. In Jordan, for example, you go to Amman, AUB alumni sort of run the place, at least when that's very subjective, because I haven't been there a long time. But when I was there, every other person I met was an AUB alum. For that matter, my late husband came into my AUB life in his later years when we were married. And he said, every other person I meet with you is from AUB, and that's in Southern California. And it's true, you go, I woke up from my colonoscopy, and the anesthetist was an AUB graduate. So there's an AUB identity that is very pervasive in the world. And it's just AUB. That's what, I don't know. Brian, what would you say?
I would agree, Anne. There's an esprit related to the school based on the pride of the quality of the instruction and what the school stands for. And in answer to Quentin's question directly, I'm going to be both facetious and very serious. It's all of the above. It's American, it's Middle Eastern, it's Lebanese. Mm-hmm. But that's the beauty of it. It's all of those things. It's a lovely potpourri of identities and loyalties. But how often do you see that in that region of the world? That's what makes it so exceptional.
Yeah.
I'd like to take
not without problems. So, I mean, the Shiite and Sunni and clash is seen on the campus. We shouldn't over idealize it, but that's okay because it gets worked through.
Yes, they're at least, they are not confronting, but they are interacting with one another. And that's a preciously rare quality very often in that region where the divisions create isolation and bubbles, and you're never, ever going to find common ground when you live in respective bubbles. Yeah. I'd like to answer the questions put to us by Chad from John. The relationship between AUB and Robert College is one of a junior partner. As I think Quentin well know, Robert College was the original. It was the first American missionary school in the Middle East. I think over time, again, I may be biased, I think AUB has become the first among equals. But Robert College deserves credit for being the first. Now, from John Morton, the present circumstances affecting Lebanon, can you tell us whether AUB and its alumni associations are still active in setting up new universities in the Gulf? Well, I think Anne answered that question in part, but I'm going to let her follow up on it too.
Okay, we didn't set up universities in the Gulf. I think what the person knows about it perhaps is that AU Sharjah in the Gulf was sort of mentored by AUB's Department of Research and Overseas Programs. And that was actually during the war years, I think.
Yeah, yes, because I sent my chats just after you'd started talking, I think. But I've got an association with Lebanon, well, since 2017, not more recently, unfortunately, and with AUB. But I did work at the American University of Sharjah and elsewhere in the UAE, and certainly I can't remember the man's name, but he came and did quite a lot of setting up,
Yes, Abdul Hamid Halab.
at Sharjah, and my late wife, who was a Lebanese Maronite, she was with me there at that time, and so I thought that, well, certainly there was a big alumni association in the UAE. I think quite a lot of Lebanese were there, whether they were both Sunni Muslims and Maronites.
Right.
And I thought also in Oman, in the University of Salalah or somewhere like that.
Yes,
well.
Actually, that's a funny story.
Probably is, yeah.
The only fact I know about this is that at a certain time, the president of that university came from AUB. He'd been an engineering professor at AUB, and subsequently he was the prime minister of Lebanon during the time of the explosion. And his name is on the tip of my tongue. Anyway.
At the time of 4th of August.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I've forgotten his name, yeah.
No, yes, the prime minister at that time. But the name of the person who sort of mentored and monitored the construction and development of Sharjah, AU Sharjah, was Abdul Hamid Halab, a wonderful man. Yeah.
Well, there was somebody else as well. yes. Dr. Halab and somebody else. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If I can, two other thoughts came to my mind I want to share with everyone briefly. The first is anyone who's familiar with the succession of presidents at that university recognize the extraordinarily high caliber of their leadership. It attracts top-notch. And I think the reason, because in the face of all of that difficult university, they understand what the university is and what it can be. It's a precious thing, especially in that region of the world. And I'm going to give you one illustration of this, which is unusual, but it's very revealing. When I published my book, shortly after publication, I was contacted by the National Library of Israel, who was keenly interested in acquiring a copy of the book and including it in their collection. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the university's exceptional nature is reflected in the fact that, for example, the first Israeli ambassador to the United States, who later became president of Hebrew University, was a graduate of AUB. And that's what I mean when I say it's been done before. It can be done again.
Okay, Clive Cookson, do you want to make your observation?
Yes, please. Yes, please. I just wanted to go back in time, can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
To point out two things, one personal, the other more historical, that Robert College and AUB were really at the pinnacle of a very pervasive Protestant educational drive throughout Lebanon and the wider Ottoman Empire. And my Lebanese grandfather's village, Dermi Mas, in the south of Lebanon, which had been a Greek Orthodox village, was entirely converted to Protestantism in the late 19th century, and with the promised reward of great education. My Lebanese grandfather went to Robert College and then to US medical school and became a doctor. My mother was one of the very first women students studying chemistry at AUB in the late 1930s. I tried to find her in that picture that Brian showed, but they were all men, fortunately, and she went on to Oxford and Harvard. So I just wanted to say, A, what a debt personally my family owes to AUB, and also to show that it was part of a much broader American Protestant drive in the region at that time. It was the pinnacle, but there was far, far more. For example, my mother went to Sidon Protestant Ladies College as her secondary school. As Brian, there was so much more than this pinnacle.
Yes, there was, and it just drives home the point that opportunities like that in that region of the world are precious opportunities, and that's something that people in the region understood intuitively because they benefited from what Bliss and his descendants offered, not in words but in deeds. For example, some of the earliest and most enthusiastic students at AUB, those who received healing medical treatment from American Protestant missionaries who've been trained in medicine. So in other words, you can tell people you care about them, or you can care for them. And we all know that caring for people is far more powerful than just saying you care about them.
Can I ask, is there any connection between AUB and the American Community School?
And can you feel that?
Well, I believe it was founded by professors who, as a school for their children. And I know my husband Malcolm, my late husband Malcolm, was a student there in the 30s, 40s.
Huh. Well,
and it was in a little house, if any of you know Jeanne d'Arc Street, where it was right up there in the corner.
Well, my family, my aunt and uncle had a house on Jeanne d'Arc Street, a building. They're the Macdissy family, and my mother was headmistress at during the Second World War. So she was a student, and when all the Americans left, there were, I think, about 23 students left, and they asked her to run the school during the Second World War. So, nice. So maybe your husband was part of it then.
Maybe so. That's nice. The family names would be apparent in the school at that time. You know, there were Dodges and Blisses and.
Yes, I mean we knew. Well, at least my mother knew the Dodges, David Dodge, I think in particular. There as a teenager, so I don't remember very many of the names. Actually, another question, if I may, just the American Repertory Theatre or art, was that part of AUB? Do you recall that at all?
American what was that?
The Repertory Theatre. It was the amateur dramatics. I think it was connected with AUB or ACS.
Yes. Well, all the different times I was there, it was definitely a group of American professors and a few others, but I don't know if AUB started it or not.
Okay.
A lady has a comment.
Yes.
Yes, it's Elder Calbian. I've got a little anecdote if we have time, which I've only really heard about recently. And also I'd recommend to any of you, if you want to read and find out what was going on at the AUB, well, certainly when my grandfather was studying there, there's a magazine called the Al Kuliye, And my grandfather was very prolific. Sadly, no one looked up my father when they went, but my grandfather was very prolific, and there's a lot about him. And he mentions, there's lovely quotes when he says, the Blisses have gone back to the States. They're having a lovely time. You know, our warm family from, you know, he was president of the union, our warm family. All our subscribers feel the warm personal interest in Dr. Bliss and his wife that has come with the long years since the first class graduated, etc., etc. So it's amazing how the students obviously felt very close to him, and there was that real family. But my grandfather was born in Diyarbakir in Turkey, Dikranagerd, you know, which is where a lot of Armenians came from. And he studied there at the AUB between 1910 and 1617 as a medical student, along with doing all this drama and everything else he seemed to be doing, according to this magazine. And the story goes that he went back home when he graduated, and his mother, who was a bon viveur, organized a huge party for him. And there was a lot of dancing and drinking and partying. And she on a table and started to dance, fell over, broke her hip. And my grandfather said, there's only one place to go. We've got to go and see my professor at the AUB. And I don't know, 2 carriages, 3, I mean, they were a wealthy family, 2 or 3 carriages. They went all the way back to Beirut to go and see this surgeon who operated on her and healed the hip. But more importantly, by leaving, they avoided being part of the genocide, and the rest of the family that didn't come on this trip were all killed, unfortunately. So, and I heard this when I was in Jerusalem taking a tour. I didn't tell people who I was. And the man said, we'd like to tell you the story of the hip. And the story was told of, you know, an Armenian family. And I just put my hand up and I said, that is my grandfather.
Excellent, thank you. Any other sort of thoughts or observation you'd like to share? Brian, do you want to sort of draw things to a close? Any concluding remarks you'd like to make?
Just a very brief one, which is AUB's importance today and tomorrow is what it's always been. It is a precious jewel in a very, very troubled region. And in my personal opinion, what it has to offer is the only way out of that interminable maze. There is no alternative future that will succeed other than what AUB represents and stands for. And I just want to read very briefly a comment that Bayard Dodge made. This is from the book. These are his words. The peoples of the Middle must be educated to solve the problem of entering into cooperation with their neighbors at the same time that they uphold their own independence and national sovereignty. The golden rule is more far-reaching than the atomic bomb. Play a leading part in helping the peoples of the Middle East to avoid the dangers and to enjoy the benefits of their independence. The responsibility is a great one. It is truer than ever before that history is a race between education and catastrophe.
Thank you. Just if I have a few words, thank you so much to Brian, VanDeMark, Anka, and others who've contributed. Yes, clearly, AUB will remain a centre, a jewel in the Middle East for many years to come. For our part, as the foundation, we would very much one day like to hold an event in Beirut when we can. We've talked about it for a number of years, and each time it seems to recede a little further away from us. But we'll have that aspiration one day to encourage people to come to Beirut to maybe, in collaboration with AUB, hold an event that can talk more about these things. So with that, thank you very much, all of you, and I wish you good night and good evening.
Thank you, Quentin, and everyone else.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.